The morning sun barely peeked through the clouds when Rosa Martinez stepped off the city bus at Fifth Avenue. She clutched her old brown purse tighter as she looked up at the towering glass building that housed the famous Harmony Music Center. This wasn't her usual stop. Most days, she would ride 3 more blocks to reach the office buildings where she worked as a night cleaner. But today was different. Today was the day she had been dreaming about for 3 long years. Rosa checked the crumpled piece of paper in her hand one more time. The address was correct. She had called the music center 5 times just to make sure she had written it down right. Her daughter Amy had helped her fill out the online application form, translating some of the fancy music words that Rosa didn't understand. Amy was 17 and much better with computers than her mother. Walking through the revolving glass, doors felt like entering another world. The lobby was filled with marble floors so shiny that Rosa could see her reflection. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and classical music played softly from hidden speakers. Rosa had cleaned plenty of fancy buildings, but this place felt different. It felt like music lived in these walls. She wore her best dress, a navy blue one with small white flowers that she had bought at a thrift store 2 years ago. It was clean and pressed, but next to all the expensive-looking people walking around, Rosa felt like she was wearing a costume to a party where she didn't belong. Her shoes were comfortable black flats, the kind she wore to work because they didn't make noise on the floors she mopped. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt endless. Rosa watched the numbers light up, counting each floor as her heart beat faster. She had practiced this moment hundreds of times in her tiny apartment, but now that it was real, her hands were shaking. She pressed them together and took deep breaths like Amy had taught her. When the elevator doors opened, Rosa saw a long hallway with dark wood panels and gold-framed pictures of famous musicians. She recognized some faces from the classical music, books she borrowed from the library. These were the great masters, the people whose music she had been learning to play on her old keyboard for the past 3 years. The reception area was buzzing with activity. Young people sat in leather chairs, some with expensive-looking instrument cases beside them. They all seemed to know each other, chatting about music schools and teachers with names Rosa had never heard of. Their clothes looked brand new, and many of them had that confident look that comes from growing up with money. Rosa approached the reception desk where a young woman with perfectly styled hair was checking people in. The receptionist barely looked up when Rosa said her name. She handed Rosa a number tag and pointed toward the waiting area without much interest. Rosa took the tag and found an empty chair near the back, trying to make herself as small as possible. As she sat down, Rosa couldn't help but listen to the conversations around her. A tall young man with blonde hair was talking about his recent performance at some famous concert hall. A girl with red hair mentioned her piano teacher, who had studied with someone important in Vienna. Another group was discussing their college, degrees from music schools that Rosa had only seen mentioned in magazine articles. Rosa felt her confidence starting to slip away. What was she doing here? She was just a cleaning lady who had taught herself to play piano by watching videos on her phone during lunch breaks. She had no fancy degrees, no famous teachers, no rich parents to pay for expensive lessons. She had learned to read music from library books and practiced on a second-hand keyboard that Amy had found at a garage sale. But then Rosa remembered why she was here. 3 years ago, Amy had been going through a hard time. Her father had left when she was small, and Rosa worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment. Amy was angry a lot, getting into trouble at school and staying out late with friends who weren't good influences. Rosa was worried about her daughter's future and didn't know how to help. One evening, while cleaning an office building, Rosa had found an old keyboard that someone was throwing away. It was missing a few keys and the sound wasn't perfect, but it worked. She brought it home thinking maybe Amy would be interested in music, but Amy just rolled her eyes and went to her room. That night, Rosa sat down at the keyboard and pressed a few keys. The sound was soft and pretty, even though the keyboard was old. She had always loved music but never had the chance to learn an instrument when she was young. Her family was poor, and there was no money for piano lessons. Over the next few weeks, Rosa started spending a few minutes each night at the keyboard after Amy went to sleep. She found free piano lessons on her phone and watched them with headphones so she wouldn't wake her daughter. Slowly, she learned to read music and play simple songs. Amy noticed what her mother was doing and became curious. Instead of going out with her troublesome friends, she started sitting with Rosa in the evenings, listening to her practice. Sometimes Amy would try to play too, and they would laugh together when they made mistakes. Music became something they shared, a way to connect after years of growing apart. As months passed, Rosa got better at playing. She learned harder songs and started to understand how music worked. Amy's grades improved, and she stopped getting into trouble. She even started helping her mother find new songs to learn. When Amy graduated from high school with good grades, she told Rosa that watching her mother chase her dreams had inspired her to work harder too. That's when Amy suggested that Rosa enter the piano competition. She had seen the advertisement online and thought her mother was good enough to try. Rosa laughed at first. How could someone like her compete with real musicians? But Amy insisted, and after weeks of encouragement, Rosa finally agreed to try. The application fee was expensive, more than Rosa spent on groceries in a week. She saved money by walking to work instead of taking the bus and by skipping lunch for 2 months. Amy helped by getting a part-time job at a local restaurant. Together, they saved enough money for Rosa to enter the competition. Now, sitting in this fancy waiting room surrounded by young musicians with their expensive clothes and impressive backgrounds, Rosa wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe Amy was just being a loving daughter when she said Rosa played beautifully. Maybe the music that sounded good in their small apartment would sound amateur and embarrassing on a real stage. But Rosa had come too far to give up now. She thought about all those nights practicing after work when her fingers were sore from cleaning and her back ached from mopping floors. She thought about Amy's proud smile when she played a song perfectly for the first time. She thought about the dreams she had given up when she was young and how it felt to have a second chance. Rosa took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She might not look like the other contestants, and she might not have their training or their fancy backgrounds, but she had something they might not have. She had a story to tell through her music, a story of hard work and love and never giving up on dreams, no matter how old you are when you find them. Rosa found a seat in the corner of the waiting room, hoping to blend into the background. She placed her old canvas bag on the floor beside her chair and tried to look invisible. But even sitting quietly, she could feel eyes on her. The other contestants kept glancing in her direction, and she could hear whispered conversations that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. A group of 3 young women sat across from her, their designer handbags casually placed on the expensive coffee table between them. One of them, a girl with perfectly straight black hair and diamond earrings, kept looking at Rosa and whispering to her friends. Rosa pretended to read the competition program, but she could hear bits of their conversation. "Did you see what she's wearing?" the girl whispered, not as quietly as she thought. "That dress looks like it came from a yard sale." Her friend, a blonde with a Louis Vuitton purse, giggled softly. "Maybe she's here to clean the piano before the real contestants perform." The third girl, wearing what looked like a very expensive suit, added, "I heard the janitor talking to the receptionist earlier. She actually thinks she's competing today." Rosa's face grew hot, but she kept her eyes down, pretending she couldn't hear them. She had dealt with comments like this before at her cleaning jobs. Some people thought that because she mopped floors and emptied trash cans, she wasn't worth their respect. But it still hurt every time. Across the room, a young man with perfectly styled brown hair was holding court with a group of admirers. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Rosa made in 3 months, and his confidence filled the space around him. His name tag read Diego Castellanos, and everyone seemed to know who he was. "I just finished my master's degree at Juilliard," Diego was saying, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My teacher studied directly under Vladimir Horowitz. He says I have the most natural talent he's seen in 20 years. The people around him nodded and made impressed sounds. One girl asked about his upcoming concert tour, and Diego smiled like he was already famous. "My agent is booking me in 3 different countries this fall. European audiences really appreciate True artistry. Rosa had never heard of Juilliard before she started learning piano, but she knew it was one of the most famous music schools in the world. She had looked it up online after hearing it mentioned in a documentary. The idea that someone her age could study there seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. A few chairs away, two young men were comparing their expensive watches and talking about their piano teachers. One mentioned paying $15,000 for a summer program in Austria. The other bragged about his private lessons that cost $300 per hour. Rosa did quick math in her head and realized that one of those lessons cost more than she made in a week of cleaning offices. "My parents flew my piano to my dorm room," one of them said casually. "It's a 1924 Steinway that belonged to my great-grandmother. The moving company charged $8,000, but Dad said it was worth it for my education." Rosa thought about her old keyboard with its missing keys and wondered what these young people would think if they knew that was her only instrument. She had dreamed of playing on a real piano, but the only time she ever touched one was when she cleaned the lobby of a hotel that had an old upright piano in the corner. Late at night when no one was around, she would sometimes press a few keys just to hear the difference in sound. The conversations continued around her, each one making Rosa feel smaller and more out of place. These young people talked about summer homes in Europe, private concerts, and musical opportunities that Rosa had never even imagined existed. They had grown up in a world where music lessons were as normal as going to school, where expensive instruments were family heirlooms, and where talent was nurtured from childhood by the best teachers money could buy. Meanwhile, Rosa had learned to play by watching free videos on her phone during her 15-minute breaks at work. She had practiced scales while waiting for the bus, and memorized pieces by humming them while she vacuumed office carpets. Her musical education had come from library books and determination, not from fancy schools and famous teachers. A girl with red hair and a violin case beside her chair was telling everyone about her recent performance with a youth orchestra. "The conductor said I played with such maturity for someone my age," she said proudly. "He's written me a recommendation letter for conservatory. My parents are so excited." Rosa felt a pang of sadness thinking about her own parents, who had died years ago without ever knowing that their daughter had musical dreams. They had worked hard their whole lives just to put food on the table, and the idea of music lessons would have seemed like an impossible luxury. Rosa wished they could see her now, about to perform on a real stage, even if everyone around her thought she didn't belong there. The whispers and stares continued throughout the morning. When Rosa got up to use the restroom, she heard someone behind her say, "I wonder if she knows this isn't a job interview." The comment was followed by quiet laughter that made Rosa's stomach clench with anxiety. At one point, a young man sitting near her struck up what seemed like a friendly conversation. "So where did you study music?" he asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I taught myself," Rosa answered honestly, hoping maybe she had found someone who would understand. The young man's smile faltered. "Oh, you mean like as a hobby?" "No, I mean I learned to play piano by studying books and watching lessons online," Rosa explained, her voice getting quieter as she noticed other people starting to listen. The room fell silent for a moment. Then someone in the back snorted with laughter, and soon others were trying to hide their smiles behind their hands. Rosa felt her cheeks burning as the young man who had asked the question looked embarrassed for her. "That's interesting," he said awkwardly before quickly turning back to his previous conversation. Diego, the confident young man from Juilliard, had overheard the exchange. "Well, that explains a lot," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was wondering why someone brought their housekeeper to a piano competition." The room erupted in barely contained giggles and whispers. Rosa wanted to disappear into her chair, but there was nowhere to hide. She thought about getting up and leaving, about taking the bus back home and pretending this had never happened. Amy would understand. Her daughter had always been proud of her for trying, even if it didn't work out. But then Rosa remembered something Amy had said when they were practicing together the night before the audition. "Mom, you play with your heart, not just your fingers. That's what makes your music special. All those other people might have fancy training, but they don't have your story." Rosa straightened up in her chair and took a deep breath. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them think she didn't belong here. In a few hours, She would have her chance to show them what 3 years of dedication and love for music could accomplish. She might not have their expensive education or their designer clothes, but she had something they couldn't buy in any store or learn in any classroom. She had a lifetime of experiences that had taught her what music could really mean. The waiting room had been slowly emptying as contestants were called one by one to perform. Rosa watched each person walk through the heavy wooden doors that led to the audition hall, their confident steps echoing in the marble corridor. Some came back with smiles, others looked disappointed, but all of them had something Rosa envied. They belonged in this world of classical music. As the afternoon wore on, Rosa's number got closer. She had been assigned number 47 out of 50 contestants. At first, she thought this was bad luck, having to wait so long while her nerves ate away at her confidence. But now she realized it might have been a blessing. She had watched the other contestants, learned from their body language when they returned, and slowly built up her courage. Diego had performed earlier and came back with a satisfied smile, high-fiving his friends and talking about how the judges had nodded approvingly during his piece. The red-haired girl with the violin case had gone in looking nervous but returned with tears of joy, saying the judges had asked her to play an extra piece. One by one, Rosa saw these talented young people prove they belonged exactly where they were. "Number 46, you're up next," called the assistant with the clipboard. A young man who had been sitting quietly in the corner stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the doors. Rosa realized she was next. Her heart started beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. She opened her canvas bag and pulled out the sheet music she had been carrying. The pages were worn from months of practice, with pencil marks where she had written reminders to herself. Some of the other contestants had performed from memory, but Rosa didn't trust herself to remember everything perfectly when she was this nervous. Amy had helped her organize the music in a folder, writing "Good luck, Mom" on the inside cover in her neat handwriting. The piece Rosa had chosen was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It wasn't the most difficult piece in the world, but it was beautiful, and she had connected with it from the first time she heard it. Late at night, after cleaning office buildings, she would come home and play this piece softly on her keyboard, letting the gentle melody wash away the tiredness from her body and the loneliness from her heart. When she first started learning it, the piece had seemed impossible. Her fingers couldn't move fast enough for the flowing passages, and she couldn't make the melody sing the way it was supposed to. But month after month, she practiced. She played it slowly at first, then gradually faster. She listened to recordings of famous pianists playing it, trying to understand how they made it sound so effortless and emotional. Amy had been her biggest supporter during those long months of practice. When Rosa got frustrated and wanted to give up, Amy would sit beside her and say, "Play it again, Mom. You're getting better every time." Sometimes Amy would even hum along, and Rosa would feel like they were making music together. "Number 47, Rosa Martinez," the assistant called out. Rosa's hands went cold. This was it. She stood up on shaky legs, picked up her music folder, and walked toward the doors. Behind her, she could hear the remaining contestants whispering. Someone said, "This should be interesting," and another person laughed quietly. The doors opened into a large concert hall with rows of empty red velvet seats. At the front of the room was a beautiful black grand piano that seemed to glow under the stage lights. Rosa had never seen such a magnificent instrument up close. It was so different from her little keyboard at home that for a moment she wondered if she would even know how to play it. At a long table in front of the stage sat 3 judges. Rosa recognized one of them from the classical music magazines she sometimes looked at in the library. Professor Catherine Wong was a famous pianist who had performed with orchestras around the world. Next to her sat an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, and a younger woman who looked very serious as she wrote notes on a pad of paper. "Good afternoon," said Professor Wong with a polite smile. "Please state your name and the piece you'll be performing today." Rosa's voice came out smaller than she intended. "My name is Rosa Martinez, and I'll be playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. The judges wrote something on their papers. The older man looked up at her with curiosity. And where are you currently studying, Ms. Martinez? Rosa felt her cheeks get warm. This was the question she had been dreading. I'm self-taught, sir. I learned to play by studying books and online videos. The three judges exchanged glances. Professor Wong raised her eyebrows slightly. I see. And how long have you been playing piano? 3 years, Rosa answered, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a moment of silence that felt like an hour. Rosa could see the judges trying to process this information. 3 years was nothing in the world of classical piano. Most of the other contestants had been playing since they were small children, studying for 15 or 20 years with professional teachers. Well, said the younger woman judge, please proceed to the piano whenever you're ready. Rosa walked across the stage, each step echoing in the quiet hall. The piano bench was exactly the right height, and when she sat down, she felt like she was settling into the driver's seat of a car she had never driven before. The keys were perfectly white and black, not yellowed and chipped like the ones on her keyboard at home. She placed her music on the stand and adjusted it so she could see clearly. Her hands were trembling as she positioned them over the keys. From the corner of her eye, she could see the judges waiting patiently, their pens ready to write their evaluations. Rosa closed her eyes and tried to calm her racing heart. She thought about Amy, who was probably at her part-time job right now, telling her co-workers about her mom's big audition. She thought about all those nights practicing in their tiny apartment, with the neighbors upstairs stomping around and the traffic noise outside. She thought about the dreams she had given up when she was young and the second chance she was giving herself now. When she opened her eyes, Rosa looked down at the keys and saw her reflection in their polished surface. For just a moment, she saw not a nervous cleaning lady in a thrift store dress, but a woman who had worked hard for this moment, who had earned the right to be here through dedication and love of music. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The first chord rang out clear and pure, filling the concert hall with sound that was richer and more beautiful than anything Rosa had ever heard from her keyboard at home. The piano responded to her touch like it was alive, and suddenly she forgot about the judges, forgot about the other contestants, forgot about everything except the music. This was her moment. After 3 years of dreaming, months of saving money, and weeks of nervous preparation, Rosa Martinez was finally ready to show the world what she could do. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne flowed from Rosa's fingers like water from a gentle stream. The sound that came from the grand piano was nothing like what she had ever heard from her old keyboard at home. Each note was rich and full, filling the concert hall with warmth that seemed to wrap around everyone in the room. Rosa had practiced this piece hundreds of times, but playing it on this beautiful instrument felt like experiencing it for the first time. The piano responded to every tiny movement of her fingers, every slight change in pressure, every emotion she poured into the keys. It was as if the piano wanted to help her tell her story. In the balcony above, the remaining contestants had gathered to watch the performances. They usually chatted quietly among themselves, making comments about each player's technique or pointing out mistakes. But something was different now. The whispered conversations had stopped completely. Diego, who had been making jokes about Rosa just an hour earlier, found himself leaning forward in his seat, his mouth slightly open in surprise. The melody Rosa was playing was simple on the surface, but underneath it was a complexity that spoke of deep understanding. She wasn't just hitting the right notes at the right time. She was breathing life into the music, making each phrase tell part of a larger story. The way she shaped the melody reminded everyone listening of something they couldn't quite name, maybe a lullaby their mother had sung, or the feeling of coming home after a long journey. Professor Wong, who had heard thousands of piano auditions over her career, felt something she rarely experienced anymore. Goosebumps ran up her arms as Rosa's interpretation unfolded. This wasn't the technically perfect but emotionally cold performance she often heard from conservatory students. This was music that came from somewhere deeper, somewhere real. The older judge, Dr. Benjamin Foster, had been ready to write his evaluation after the first few measures. He had assumed this would be a brief, probably painful experience. But now, his pen lay forgotten on the table as he watched Rosa's face while she played. Her eyes were closed and she swayed gently with the music, completely lost in the piece. He had seen many talented young pianists, but he had rarely seen someone so completely connected to what they were playing. As the piece continued, Rosa found herself remembering why she had first fallen in love with this particular nocturne. It had been during one of her hardest periods, when Amy was going through her rebellious phase and Rosa was working 3 different cleaning jobs just to pay rent. She had been exhausted and discouraged, wondering if she was failing as a mother and if her life would ever get better. That night, she had found a recording of this piece on her phone and listened to it while taking the bus home from work. The music had spoken to her tired heart, telling her that sadness could be beautiful, that struggle could create something meaningful, and that even in the darkest moments, there was still hope for light. Now, as she played those same notes that had comforted her, Rosa felt all of those emotions flowing through her fingers. She wasn't just playing Chopin's music. She was sharing her own story of working late nights while dreaming of something better, of watching her daughter struggle and not knowing how to help, of finding hope in unexpected places. The technical passages that had given her so much trouble during practice now seemed to play themselves. Her fingers moved across the keys with confidence she had never felt before. The months of slow practice, of playing each section over and over until her hands remembered every movement, had prepared her for this moment when technique would serve, emotion instead of getting in its way. In the balcony, the girl with the red hair who had performed beautifully earlier found herself wiping away a tear. She couldn't understand why this simple piece, played by a woman who clearly hadn't had professional training, was affecting her so deeply. But there was something in Rosa's playing that touched a part of her heart that all her expensive lessons had never reached. Even Diego, who prided himself on his sophisticated musical taste, was having trouble processing what he was hearing. This wasn't the way Chopin was supposed to be played according to his teachers at Juilliard. Rosa's interpretation was more personal, more emotional than the controlled perfection he had been taught to achieve. But somehow, it worked. Somehow, it was exactly right. The middle section of the nocturne arrived where the melody becomes more complex and demanding. This was the part Rosa had worried about most during her practice. But as she played it now, each note seemed to know exactly where it needed to go. Her left hand provided a steady, gentle accompaniment, while her right hand sang the melody with a clarity that surprised even her. Professor Wong found herself thinking about her own journey with music. She had started playing when she was 4 years old, had studied with the best teachers, and had performed on the most prestigious stages in the world. But when had she last felt the pure joy and connection that she was witnessing right now? When had music last moved her the way Rosa's playing was moving her in this moment? The younger judge, Dr. Lisa Chen, had been prepared to be polite, but not impressed. The competition had been long, and most of the performances had blended together in her mind. She had heard this particular Chopin piece played dozens of times by students who knew every note perfectly, but Rosa's version was different. It wasn't perfect in the technical sense. There were tiny hesitations, moments where her fingering wasn't quite what a conservatory teacher would recommend, but it was perfect in a way that mattered more. As the piece built toward its emotional climax, Rosa felt something she had never experienced before. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. All the years of doubt, all the moments when she had wondered if she was foolish to dream of music at her age, all the nights when she had practiced with tired fingers and an aching back. It all made sense now. The final section of the nocturne began, where the melody returns but softer, more reflective, like a memory of something beautiful. Rosa played these last phrases with a tenderness that spoke of gratitude. Gratitude for second chances, for daughters who believe in their mother's dreams, for music that can transform ordinary moments into something magical. The last note hung in the air like a prayer, gradually fading into silence. Rosa kept her hands on the keys for a moment, not wanting to break the spell that had settled over the room. When she finally opened her eyes and looked up, she saw something she had never expected to see. The 3 judges were staring at her with expressions of complete amazement. Professor Wong's hands were pressed to her chest. Dr. Foster was leaning, back in his chair with his eyes wide, and Dr. Chen was sitting perfectly still, as if she was afraid that moving would disturb something precious. The silence in the room was so complete that Rosa could hear her own heartbeat. She had done it. She had played her piece from beginning to end without making any major mistakes. But more than that, she had shared something real, something true, something that came from the deepest part of who she was. In that moment of perfect quiet, Rosa knew that regardless of what happened next, she had already won something more valuable than any competition. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Rosa sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, afraid to move or breathe too loudly. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention on her, but the quality of that attention had completely changed. Gone was the amused curiosity and barely hidden mockery from earlier. Something profound had shifted in the room. Professor Wong was the first to break the spell. She began clapping slowly, her hands coming together in a rhythm that seemed almost sacred. The sound echoed through the concert hall like a heartbeat, and gradually the other judges joined in. Dr. Foster stood up from his chair, his applause growing stronger and more enthusiastic. Dr. Chen followed, and soon all three judges were on their feet, their faces showing a mixture of surprise, admiration, and something that looked almost like reverence. In the balcony above, the remaining contestants sat frozen in their seats. Diego, who had been so confident about his own performance earlier, found himself clapping without even realizing he was doing it. The red-haired girl was openly crying, her applause mixed with sobs of emotion. One by one, the other young musicians rose to their feet, their own applause joining the symphony of appreciation filling the hall. Rosa finally lifted her hands from the keys and turned to face the judges. She couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. These distinguished music professionals, people who had heard the best pianists in the world, were giving her a standing ovation. Her legs felt weak as she stood up and took a small, uncertain bow. "Ms. Martinez," Professor Wong said, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. "That was extraordinary. Please, sit down for a moment. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Rosa nodded and walked to the chair that had been placed beside the piano for contestants to use during the interview portion of the audition. Her heart was still racing, but now it was from excitement rather than fear. Dr. Foster leaned forward, his kind eyes focused intently on Rosa. "In 30 years of judging competitions, I have rarely heard such a deeply moving performance. You mentioned that you're self-taught. Can you tell us more about your musical background?" Rosa took a deep breath. For the first time all day, she didn't feel ashamed of her story. "I started playing 3 years ago when I found an old keyboard that someone was throwing away. I brought it home for my daughter, but she wasn't interested at first, so I started playing around with it myself." "And you learned entirely from books and online videos?" Dr. Chen asked, her skepticism from earlier completely replaced by genuine curiosity. "Yes," Rosa said, her voice growing stronger. "I work as a night cleaner, so during my breaks I would watch piano lessons on my phone. I borrowed music theory books from the library and practiced whenever I could. My daughter Amy started helping me after a while. She would listen to recordings and help me understand how the pieces were supposed to sound." Professor Wong shook her head in amazement. "What you've accomplished in 3 years is remarkable. Many of our conservatory students couldn't play with that level of emotional maturity after decades of training. You have something very special." Rosa felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "Music saved my life," she said quietly. "And it saved my relationship with my daughter. When I started playing, Amy was going through a hard time, getting into trouble at school. But when she saw me working so hard to learn something new, something I loved, it inspired her to work harder too. Music brought us back together." The judges exchanged glances, and Professor Wong nodded as if a decision had been made. "Ms. Martinez, we need to deliberate with the other judges about all the performances we've heard today. But I want you to know that what you've shared with us goes far beyond technical skill. You've reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place." Rosa stood up to leave, but Dr. Foster stopped her. "Before you go, I'm curious. Why did you choose that particular Chopin piece? Rosa smiled, thinking of all those late nights, when the nocturne had been her companion. I discovered it during one of the hardest times in my life. I was working 3 jobs, Amy was struggling, and I felt like I was failing at everything. But when I heard this piece, it told me that sadness could be beautiful, that struggle could create something meaningful. Every time I played it, I felt less alone. That's exactly what came through in your performance, Professor Wong said softly. You didn't just play the notes, you shared your story with us. As Rosa walked back toward the waiting area, she could see the other contestants looking at her with completely different expressions than before. Diego approached her first, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice quiet and serious. What I said earlier was wrong. That was the most beautiful performance I've heard all day. I've been studying music my whole life, but you just taught me something about what music can really be. The red-haired girl came over next, her eyes still red from crying. I've never been so moved by a piano performance, she said. You made me remember why I started playing music in the first place. Thank you for that. One by one, the other contestants approached Rosa, offering congratulations and apologies for their earlier behavior. Some asked for advice about how to connect more emotionally with their music. Others simply wanted to shake her hand and tell her how much her performance had affected them. 2 hours later, all the contestants had performed, and the judges had finished their deliberations. They called everyone back into the concert hall for the announcement of results. Rosa sat in the back, still processing everything that had happened. Regardless of the outcome, she knew this day had changed her life. Professor Wong stood up to address the group. This has been one of the most challenging competitions we've ever judged, she began. We've heard exceptional technical skill, beautiful interpretations, and remarkable talent from musicians of all ages and backgrounds. She paused and looked directly at Rosa. But one performance today reminded us that music is not just about perfect technique or years of training. Music is about truth, about sharing our humanity with others, about transforming our experiences into something that can touch other people's hearts. Rosa's hands began to shake as Professor Wong continued. This year's winner of the international piano competition is Rosa Martinez. The room erupted in applause. Rosa sat in shock as the other contestants cheered and clapped around her. Diego was the first to reach her, pulling her up from her chair and hugging her tightly. You deserve this, he said in her ear. You really deserve this. As Rosa walked to the stage to accept her award, she thought about Amy, who was probably just getting home from work. She couldn't wait to call her daughter and share the news. Amy had believed in her when Rosa didn't believe in herself. Amy had seen the musician in her mother before Rosa even knew she existed. Professor Wong handed Rosa a trophy and an envelope. Along with this recognition comes a full scholarship to study music at any institution you choose, she said. It's never too late to pursue your dreams. Rosa held the trophy and looked out at the audience of young musicians who had become her supporters and friends. 3 years ago, she had been a single mother working multiple jobs, feeling like her best. Years were behind her. Today, she was proof that it's never too late to discover who you're meant to be. Music doesn't care how old you are when you find it, Rosa said, her voice carrying clearly through the concert hall. It only cares that you're brave enough to let it change your life. The applause that followed was the sweetest sound Rosa had ever heard.